And there we are. Good evening. And happy Halloween morning to all of you out there. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever it may happen to be, wherever you are. I'm Tad Williams. Most of you know that right now. And I am planning to do some reading. However, because we have finished the previous volume. Ooh, how's that? That's even spookier. Spooky. Because we have finished the previous volume, and because today is Halloween, and in fact, because I even pushed the reading up a full day, I thought I would read you some scary stories, some appropriately Halloweenish stories. So let's see who's here. Ilva, hello, my dear. Lovely to see you. Ronnie and Leah and Michael and Marie Jose and Petra and Kella. Well, that's a new name. Cool. Hello, Kella. Jeremy, Steve, Paul. A chilly morning to you, too. Well, it's not that chilly because I'm inside, but I'm sure it's chilly out there, and I'm sure that there are people who are chilly who are listening even though they're inside. But a few shivers seems appropriate on Halloween. Anything to report about our household? No, simply that we are in the Halloween mode. The kids were playing Dungeons and Dragons, and they're going to be doing the same thing tomorrow, but dressing up for it. So they've been dealing with their costumes and makeup and whatnot. And I am going to be probably even slightly more Halloweeny tomorrow night, or tonight, I should say. Of course, this is now Saturday, so 7 p.m. when I read again. And I will read different things, almost certainly. Including something I probably won't get to tonight, which is one of my stories that I didn't want to read earlier because it's really not, it's kind of a creepy story. I thought it would be better to save for Halloween or something similar. Anyway, so without further ado, I am going to, hello, Holger. I am going to start reading. And I have a couple of things. I'm not quite sure how long any of these are going to take. So I am just going to read as I read and see what we have time for. But I can guarantee you that at least one or two of the whatever it is that I wind up reading you won't have heard before. So I'm going to start with an old favorite of mine by the writer Fritz Leiber, who I was fortunate enough to meet in his later days. But I had been a reader of his for 20 or 30 years before I finally met him. Well, probably more like 20 something. But anyway, he is best known, of course, in the fantasy community for his wonderful Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser books, which were collected in a series of editions, because most of them are stories, but some of them are linked stories, and they were collected in a series of books called Swords Against Death, Swords Against Deviltry, Swords of Lankmar, Swords in the Mist, Swords Against Wizardry, something like that. Anyway, 5, 6, 7 books that came out a while ago. This is not one of his Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories, though. This is something a bit more modern, and it's always been a favorite of mine, so I am going to read it, and I hope you enjoy it. It's called Smoke Ghost, again by Fritz Leiber. Miss Millick wondered just what had happened to Mr. Rand. He kept making the strangest remarks when she took dictation. Just this morning he had quickly turned around and asked, "Have you ever seen a ghost, Miss Millick?" And she had tittered nervously and replied, "When I was a girl, there was a thing in white that used to come out of the closet in the attic bedroom when I slept there and moan. Of course, it was just my imagination. I was frightened of lots of things." And he had said, "I don't mean that kind of ghost. I meant a ghost from the world today, with the soot of the factories on its face and the pounding machinery in its soul, the kind that would haunt coal yards and slip around at night through deserted office buildings, like this one. A real ghost, not something out of books." And she hadn't known what to say. He'd never been like this before. Of course, he might be joking, but it didn't sound that way. Vaguely, Miss Millick wondered whether he mightn't be seeking some sort of sympathy from her. Of course, Mr. Rand was married and had a little child, but that didn't prevent her from having daydreams. The daydreams were not very exciting. Still, they helped fill up her mind, but now he was asking her another of those unprecedented questions. Have you ever thought what a ghost of our times would look like, Miss Millick? Just picture it. A smoky, composite face, with the hungry anxiety of the unemployed, the neurotic restlessness of the person without purpose, the jerky tension of the high-pressure metropolitan worker, the uneasy resentment of the striker, the callous opportunism of the scab, the aggressive whine of the panhandler, the inhibited terror of the bombed civilian, and a thousand other twisted emotional patterns, each one overlying and yet blending with the other like a pile of semi-transparent masks. Miss Millick gave a little self-conscious shiver and said, "That would be terrible. What an awful thing to think of." She peered furtively across the desk. Was he going crazy? She remembered having heard that there was something impressively abnormal about Mr. Rand's childhood, but she couldn't recall what it was. If only she could do something, laugh at his mood, or ask him what was really wrong. She shifted the extra pencils in her left hand and mechanically traced over some of the shorthand curlicues in her notebook. Yes, yet that's just what such a ghost or vitalized projection would look like, Miss Millick, he continued, smiling in a tight way. It would grow out of the real world. It would reflect all the tangled, sordid, vicious things, all the loose ends, and it would be very grimy. I don't think it would seem white or wispy or favor graveyards. It wouldn't moan, but it would mutter unintelligibly and twitch at your sleeve like a sick, surly ape. What would such a thing want from a person, Miss Millick? Sacrifice? Worship? Or just fear? What could you do to stop it from troubling you? Miss Millick giggled nervously. There was an expression beyond her powers of definition in Mr. Rand's ordinary, flat-cheeked, 30-ish face, silhouetted against the dusty window. He turned away and stared out into the gray downtown atmosphere that rolled in from the railroad yards and the mills. When he spoke again, his voice sounded far away. Of course, being immaterial, it couldn't hurt you physically, at first. You'd have to be particularly sensitive even to see it or be aware of it at all. But it would begin to influence your actions, make you do this, stop you from doing that. Although only a projection, it would gradually get its hooks into the world of things as they are. Might even get control of suitably vacuous minds. Then it could hurt whomever it wanted. Miss Millick squirmed and read back her shorthand like the book said you should do when there was a pause. She became aware of the failing light and wished Mr. Rand would ask her to turn on the overhead. She felt scratchy, as if soot were sifting down onto her skin. It's a rotten world, Miss Millick, said Mr. Rand, talking from the window. Fit for another morbid growth of superstition. It's time the ghosts, or whatever you call them, took over and began a rule of fear. They'd be no worse than men. But, Miss Millick's diaphragm jerked, making her titter inanely. Of course there aren't any such thing as ghosts. Mr. Rand turned around. Of course there aren't, Miss Millick, he said in a loud, patronizing voice, as if she had been doing the talking rather than he. Science and common sense and psychiatry all go to prove it. She hung her head and might even have blushed if she hadn't felt so all at sea. Her leg muscles twitched, making her stand up, although she hadn't intended to. She aimlessly rubbed her hand back and forth along the edge of the desk. Why, Mr. Rand, look what I got off your desk, she said, showing him a heavy smudge. There was a note of clumsily playful reproof in her voice. No wonder the copy I bring you always gets so black. Somebody ought to talk to those scrub women. Those scrub women, they're skimping on your room. She wished he would make some normal joking reply, but instead he drew back and his face hardened. Well, to get back to that business of the second-class mailing privileges, he rapped out harshly and began to dictate. When she was gone, he jumped up, dabbed his finger experimentally at the smudged part of the desk, frowned worriedly at the almost inky smears. He jerked open a drawer, snatched out a rag, hastily swabbed off the desk, crumpled the rag into a ball, and tossed it back. There were 3 or 4 other rags in the drawer, each impregnated with soot. Then he strode over to the window and peered out anxiously through the gathering dusk, his eyes searching the panorama of roofs, fixing on each chimney and water tank. It's a neurosis. Must be compulsions, hallucinations, he muttered to himself in a tired, distraught voice that would have made Miss Millet gasp. It's that damned mental abnormality cropping up in a new form. Can't be any other explanation, but it's so damned real. Even the soot. Good thing I'm seeing a psychiatrist. I don't think I could force myself to get on the elevated tonight. His voice trailed off. He rubbed his eyes, and his memory automatically started to grind. It had all begun on the elevated. There was a particular little sea of roofs he had grown into the habit of glancing at, just as the packed car carrying him homeward lurched around a turn. A dingy, melancholy little world of tar paper, tarred gravel, and smoky brick. Rusty tin chimneys with odd conical hats suggested abandoned listening posts. There was a washed-out advertisement of some ancient patent medicine on the nearest wall. Superficially, it was like 10,000 other drab city roofs, but he always saw it around dusk, either in the smoky half-light or tinged with red by the flat rays of a dirty sunset, or covered by ghostly, wind-blown white sheets of rain splash, or patched with blackish snow. And it seemed unusually bleak and suggestive, almost beautifully ugly, though in no sense picturesque, dreary, but meaningful. Unconsciously, it came to symbolize for Catesby Rann certain disagreeable aspects of the frustrated, frightened century in which he lived, the jangled century of hate and heavy industry and total wars. The quick daily glance into the half-darkness became an integral part of his life. Oddly, he never saw it in the morning, for it was then his habit to sit on the other side of the car, his head buried in the paper. One evening toward winter, he noticed what seemed to be a shapeless black sack lying on the third roof from the tracks. He did not think about it. It merely registered as an addition to the well-known scene, and his memory stored away the impression for further reference. Next evening, however, he decided he had been mistaken in one detail. The object was a roof nearer than he had thought. Its color and texture and the grimy stains around it suggested that it was filled with coal dust, which was hardly reasonable. Then, too, the following evening, it seemed to have been blown against a rusty ventilator by the wind, which could hardly have happened if it were at all heavy. Perhaps it was filled with leaves. Catesby was surprised to find himself anticipating his next daily glance with a minor note of apprehension. There was something unwholesome in the posture of the thing that stuck in his mind, a bulge in the sacking that suggested a misshapen head peering around the ventilator. And his apprehension was justified, for that evening the thing was on the nearest roof, though on the farther side, looking as if it had just flopped down over the low brick parapet. Next evening, the sack was gone. Catesby was annoyed at the momentary feeling of relief that went through him, because the whole matter seemed too unimportant to warrant feelings of any sort. What difference did it make if his imagination had played tricks on him, and he'd fancied that the object was crawling and hitching itself slowly closer across the roofs? That was the way any normal imagination worked. He deliberately chose to disregard the fact that there were reasons for thinking his imagination was by no means a normal one. As he walked home from the elevated, however, he found himself wondering whether the sack was really gone. He seemed to recall a vague, smudgy trail leading across the gravel to the nearer side of the roof, which was marked by a parapet. For an instant, an unpleasant picture formed in his mind, that of an inky, humped creature crouched behind the parapet, waiting. Then he dismissed the whole subject. The next time he felt the familiar grating lurch of the car, he caught himself trying not to look out. That angered him. He turned his head quickly. When he turned it back, his compact face was definitely pale. There had been only time for a fleeting rearward glance at the escaping roof. Had he actually seen in silhouette the upper part of a head of some sort peering over the parapet? Nonsense, he told himself. And even if he had seen something, there were 1,000 explanations which did not involve the supernatural or even true hallucination. Tomorrow he would take a good look and clear up the whole matter. If necessary, he would visit the roof personally, though he hardly knew where to find it, and disliked in any case the idea of pampering a silly fear. He did not relish the walk home that evening, and visions of the thing disturbed his dreams and were in and out of his mind all next day at the office. It was then that he first began to relieve his nerves by making jokingly serious remarks about the supernatural to Miss Millick, who seemed properly mystified. It was on the same day, too, that he became aware of a growing antipathy to grime and soot. Everything he touched seemed gritty, and he found himself mopping and wiping at his desk like an old lady with a morbid fear of germs. He reasoned that there was no real change in his office, and that he'd just now become sensitive to the dirt that had always been there. But there was no denying an increasing nervousness. Long before the car reached the curve, he was straining his eyes through the murky twilight, determined to take in every detail. Afterward, he realized that he must have given a muffled cry of some sort, for the man beside him looked at him curiously, and the woman ahead gave him an unfavorable stare. Conscious of his own pallor and uncontrollable trembling, he stared back at them hungrily, trying to regain the feeling of security he had completely lost. They were the usual reassuringly wooden-faced people everyone rides home with on the elevated. But suppose he had pointed out to one of them what he had seen, that sodden, distorted face of sacking and coal dust, that boneless paw which waved back and forth, unmistakably in his direction, as if reminding him of a future appointment. He involuntarily shut his eyes tight. His thoughts were racing ahead to tomorrow evening. He pictured this same windowed oblong of light and packed humanity surging around the curve, then an opaque, monstrous form leaping out from the roof in a parabolic swoop, an unmentionable face pressed close against the window, smearing it with wet coal dust, huge paws fumbling sloppily at the glass. Somehow he managed to turn off his wife's anxious inquiries. Next morning he reached a decision and made an appointment for that evening with a psychiatrist a friend had told him about. It cost him a considerable effort, for Catesby had a well-grounded distaste for anything dealing with psychological abnormality. Visiting a psychiatrist meant raking up an episode in his past which he had never fully described even to his wife. Once he had made the decision, however, he felt considerably relieved. The psychiatrist, he told himself, would clear everything up. He could almost fancy him saying, "Merely a bad case of nerves. However, you must consult the oculist whose name I'm writing down for you, and you must take 2 of these pills and water every 4 hours," and so on. It was almost comforting, and made the coming revelation he would have to make seem less painful. But as the smoky dust rolled in, his nervousness returned, and he let his joking mystification of Miss Millick run away with him until he realized that he wasn't frightening anyone but himself. He would have to keep his imagination under better control, he told himself, as he continued to peer out restlessly at the massive murky shapes of the downtown office buildings. Why, he had spent the whole afternoon building up a kind of neo-medieval cosmology of superstition. It wouldn't do. He realized then that he had been standing at the window much longer than he'd thought. For the glass panel in the door was dark, and there was no noise coming from the outer office. Miss Millick and the rest must have gone home. It was then he made the discovery that there would have been no special reason for dreading the swing around the curve that night. It was, as it happened, a horrible discovery. For on the shadowed roof across the street and 4 stories below, he saw the thing huddle and roll across the gravel and, after one upward look of recognition, merge into the blackness beneath the water tank. As he hurriedly collected his things and made for the elevator, fighting the panicky impulse to run, he began to think of hallucination and mild psychosis as very desirable conditions. For better or for worse, he pinned all his hopes on the psychiatrist. "So you find yourself growing nervous and jumpy, as you put it," said Dr. Trevethik, smiling with dignified geniality. "Do you notice any more definite physical symptoms? Pain, headache, indigestion?" Catesby shook his head and wet his lips. "I'm especially nervous while riding in the elevated," he murmured swiftly. "I see. We'll discuss that more fully. But I'd like you first to tell me something you mentioned earlier. You said there was something about your childhood that might predispose you to nervous ailments. As you know, the early years are critical ones in the development of an individual's behavior pattern." Catesby studied the yellow reflections of frosted globes in the dark surface of the desk. The palm of his left hand aimlessly rubbed the thick nap of the armchair. After a while, he raised his head and looked straight into the doctor's small brown eyes. "From perhaps my 3rd to my 9th year," he began, choosing the words with care, "I was what you might call a sensory prodigy." The doctor's expression did not change. "Yes?" he inquired politely. "What I mean is that I was supposed to be able to see through walls, read letters through envelopes, and books through their covers, fence and play ping pong blindfolded, find things that were buried, read thoughts." The words tumbled out. "And could you?" The doctor's expression was toneless. "I don't know. I don't suppose so," answered Catesby, long-lost emotions flooding back into his voice. "It's all confused now. I thought I could, but then they were always encouraging me. My mother was, well, interested in psychic phenomena. I was exhibited. I seem to remember seeing things other people couldn't, as if most opaque objects were transparent, but I was very young. I didn't have any scientific criteria for judgment." He was reliving it now. The darkened rooms, the earnest assemblages of gawking, prying adults, himself sitting alone on a little platform, lost in a straight-backed wooden chair, the black silk handkerchief over his eyes, his mother's coaxing, insistent questions, the whispers, the gasps, his own hate of the whole business, mixed with hunger for the adulation of adults. Then the scientists from the university, the experiments, the big test. The reality of those memories engulfed him and momentarily made him forget the reason why he was disclosing them to a stranger. "Do I understand that your mother tried to make use of you as a medium for communicating with the other world? Catesby nodded eagerly. She tried to, but she couldn't. When it came to getting in touch with the dead, I was a complete failure. All I could do, or thought I could do, was see real, existing, three-dimensional objects beyond the vision of normal people. Objects anyone could have seen except for distance, obstruction, or darkness. It was always a disappointment to Mother. He could hear her sweetish, patient voice saying, "Try again, dear, just this once. Katie was your aunt. She loved you. Try to hear what she's saying." And he had answered, "I can see a woman in a blue dress standing on the other side of Dick's house." And she replied, "Yes, I know, dear, but that's not Katie. Katie's a spirit. Try again, just this once, dear." The doctor's voice gently jarred him back into the softly gleaming office. "You mentioned scientific criteria for judgment, Mr. Rand. As far as you know, did anyone ever try to apply them to you?" Catesby's nod was emphatic. "They did. When I was 8, 2 young psychologists from the university got interested in me. I guess they did it for a joke at first, and I remember being very determined to show them I amounted to something. Even now I seem to recall how the note of polite superiority and amused sarcasm drained out of their voices. I suppose they decided at first that it was very clever trickery, but somehow they persuaded Mother to let them try me out under controlled conditions. There were a lot of tests that seemed very businesslike after Mother's slipshod little exhibitions. They found I was clairvoyant, or so they thought. I got worked up and on edge. They were going to demonstrate my supernormal sensory powers to the university psychology faculty. For the first time, I began to worry about whether I'd come through. Perhaps they kept me going at it too hard a pace. I don't know. At any rate, when the test came, I couldn't do a thing. Everything became opaque. I got desperate and made things up out of my imagination. I lied. In the end, I failed utterly, and I believe the 2 young psychologists got into a lot of hot water as a result. He could hear the brusque, bearded man saying, "You've been taken in by a child, Flaxman, a mere child. I'm greatly disturbed. You put yourself on the same plane as common charlatans. Gentlemen, I ask you to banish from your minds this whole sorry episode. It must never be referred to." Catesby winced at the recollection of his feeling of guilt, but at the same time he was beginning to feel exhilarated and almost light-hearted. Unburdening his long repressed memories had altered his whole viewpoint. The episodes on the elevated began to take on what seemed their proper proportions as merely the bizarre workings of overwrought nerves and an overly suggestible mind. The doctor, he anticipated confidently, would disentangle the obscure subconscious causes, whatever they might be. And the whole business would be finished off quickly, just as his childhood experience, which was beginning to seem a little ridiculous now, had been finished off. From that day on, he continued, I never exhibited a trace of my supposed powers. My mother was frantic and tried to sue the university. I had something like a nervous breakdown. Then the divorce was granted and my father got custody of me. He did his best to make me forget it. We went on long outdoor vacations and did a lot of athletics associated with normal, matter-of-fact people. I went to business college eventually. I'm in advertising now. But Catesby paused. Now that I'm having nervous symptoms, I've wondered if there mightn't be a connection. It's not a question of whether I really was clairvoyant or not. Very likely my mother taught me a lot of unconscious deceptions, good enough to fool even young psychology instructors, but don't you think it may have some important bearing on my present condition? For several moments, the doctor regarded him with a slightly embarrassing professional frown. Then he said quietly, "And is there some more specific connection between your experiences then and now? Do you by any chance find that you are once again beginning to see things?" Catesby swallowed. He had felt an increasing eagerness to unburden himself of his fears, but it was not easy to make a beginning, and the doctor's shrewd question rattled him. He forced himself to concentrate. The thing he thought he had seen on the roof loomed up before his inner eye with unexpected vividness, yet it did not frighten him. He groped for words. Then he saw that the doctor was not looking at him, but over his shoulder. Color was draining out of the doctor's face, and his eyes did not seem so small. Then the doctor sprang to his feet, walked past Catesby, threw open the window, and peered into the darkness. As Catesby rose, the doctor slammed down the window and said, in a voice whose smoothness was marred by a slight, persistent gasping, "I hope I haven't alarmed you. I must have frightened him, for he seems to have gotten out of sight in a hurry. Don't give it another thought. Doctors are frequently bothered by voyeurs, or peeping toms. In this case, a black man." "A Negro?" asked Catesby, moistening his lips. The doctor laughed nervously. I imagine so, though my first odd impression was that it was a white man in blackface. You see, the color didn't seem to have any brown in it. It was dead black." Catesby moved toward the window. There were smudges on the glass. "It's quite all right, Mr. Rand." The doctor's voice had acquired a sharp note of impatience, as if he were trying hard to reassume his professional authority. "Let's continue our conversation. I was asking you if you were seeing things." Catesby's whirling thoughts slowed down and locked into place. "No, I'm not seeing anything that other people don't see, too. And I think I'd better go now. I've been keeping you too long." He disregarded the doctor's half-hearted gesture of denial. "I'll phone you about the physical examination. In a way, you've already taken a big load off my mind." He smiled woodenly. "Good night, Dr. Trevithick." Catesby Rand's mental state was a peculiar one. His eyes searched every angular shadow. He glanced sideways down each chasm-like alley and barren basement passageway, and kept stealing looks at the irregular line of the roofs. Yet he was hardly conscious of where he was going. He pushed away the thoughts that came into his mind and kept moving. He became aware of a slight sense of security as he turned into a lighted street, where there were people and high buildings and blinking signs. After a while, he found himself in the dim lobby of the structure that housed his office. Then he realized why he couldn't go home. Because he might cause his wife and baby to see it, just as the doctor had seen it. "Oh, Mr. Rand," said the night elevator man, a burly figure in blue overalls, sliding open the grillwork door to the old-fashioned cage. "I didn't know you were working nights now." Catesby stepped in automatically. "Sudden rush of orders," he murmured inanely. "Some stuff that has to be gotten out." The cage creaked to a stop at the top floor. "Be you working very late, Mr. Rand?" He nodded vaguely, watched the car slide out of sight, found his keys, swiftly crossed the outer office, and entered his own. His hand went out to the light switch, but then the thought occurred to him that the two lighted windows standing out against the dark bulk of the building would indicate his whereabouts and serve as a goal toward which something could crawl and climb. He moved his chair so that the back was against the wall, and sat down in the semi-darkness. He did not remove his overcoat. For a long time he sat there motionless, listening to his own breathing and the faraway sounds from the streets below. The thin metallic surge of the crosstown streetcar, the farther one of the elevated. Faint, lonely cries and honkings, indistinct rumblings. Words he had spoken to Miss Millick in nervous jest came back to him with the bitter taste of truth. He found himself unable to reason critically or connectedly, but by their own volition, thoughts rose up into his mind and gyrated slowly and rearranged themselves with the inevitable movement of planets. Gradually, his mental picture of the world was transformed. No longer a world of material atoms and empty space, but a world in which the bodiless existed and moved according to its own obscure laws or unpredictable impulses. The new picture illumined with dreadful clarity certain general facts which had always bewildered and troubled him, and from which he had tried to hide. The inevitability of hate and war, the diabolically timed machines which wrecked the best of human intentions, the walls of willful misunderstanding that divided one man from another, the eternal vitality of cruelty and ignorance and greed. They seemed appropriate now, necessary parts of the picture, and superstition only seemed a kind of wisdom. Then his thoughts returned to himself, and the question he had asked Miss Millick came back. What would such a thing want from a person? Sacrifices? Worship? Or just fear? What could you do to stop it from troubling you? It had become a practical question. With an explosive jangle, the phone began to ring. "Kate, I've been trying everywhere to get you," said his wife. "I never thought you'd be at the office. What are you doing? I've been worried." He said something about work. "You'll be home right away?" came the faint, anxious question. "I'm a little frightened. Ronnie just had a scare. It woke him up. He kept pointing to the window, saying, 'Black man, black man.' Of course it's something he dreamed, but I'm frightened. You will be home. What's that, dear? Can't you hear me?" "I will. Right away," he said. Then he was out of the office, buzzing the night bell and peering down the shaft. He saw it peering up the shaft at him from the deep shadows 3 floors below, the sacking face pressed against the iron grillwork. It started up the stair at a shockingly swift, shambling gait, vanishing temporarily from sight as it swung into the second corridor below. Catesby clawed at the door to the office, realized he had not locked it, pushed it in, slammed and locked it behind him, retreated to the other side of the room, cowered between the filing cases and the wall. His teeth were clicking. He heard the groan of the rising elevator cage. A silhouette darkened the frosted glass of the door, blotting out part of the grotesque reverse of the company name. After a little, the door opened. The big globed overhead light flared on, and, standing just inside the door, her hand on the switch, he saw Miss Millick. "Why, Mr. Rand," she stammered. I didn't know you were here. I'd just come in to do some extra typing after the movie. I didn't... But the lights weren't on. What were you..." He stared at her. He wanted to shout in relief, grab hold of her, talk rapidly. He realized he was grinning hysterically. "Why, Mr. Rand, what's happened to you?" she asked embarrassedly, ending with a stupid titter. "Are you feeling sick? Isn't there something I can do for you?" He shook his head jerkily and managed to say, No, I'm just leaving. I was doing some extra work myself." "But you look sick," she insisted, and walked over toward him. He inconsequentially realized that she must have stepped in mud, for her high-heeled shoes left neat black prints. "Yes, I'm sure you must be sick. You're so terribly pale." She sounded like an enthusiastic, incompetent nurse. Her face brightened with a sudden inspiration. "I've got something in my bag that'll fix you up right away," she said. "It's for indigestion." She fumbled at her stuffed oblong purse. He noticed that she was absent-mindedly holding it shut with one hand while she tried to open it with the other. Then, under his very eyes, he saw her bend back the thick prongs of metal locking the purse as if they were tinfoil, or as if her fingers had become a pair of steel pliers. Instantly, his memory recited the words he had spoken to Miss Millick that afternoon. It couldn't hurt you physically, at first. Gradually get its hooks into the world, might even get control of suitable minds, then it could hurt whomever it wanted. A sickish, cold feeling came to a focus inside him. He began to edge toward the door. But Miss Millick hurried ahead of him. "You don't have to wait, Fred," she called. "Mr. Rand's decided to stay a while longer." The door to the elevator cage shut with a mechanical rattle. The cage creaked. Then she turned around in the door. "Why, Mr. Rand," she gurgled reproachfully, "I just couldn't think of letting you go home now. I'm sure you're terribly unwell. Why, you might collapse in the street. You've just got to stay here until you feel different." The creaking died away. He stood in the center of the office motionless. His eyes traced the course of Miss Millick's footprints to where she stood blocking the door. A sound that was almost a scream was wrenched out of him. "Why, Mr. Rand," she said, "you're acting as if you were crazy. You must lie down for a little while. Here, I'll help you off with your coat." The nauseously idiotic and rasping note was the same, only it had been intensified. As she came toward him, he turned and ran through the storeroom, clattered a key desperately at the lock of the second door to the corridor. "Why, Mr. Rand," he heard her call, "are you having some kind of fit? You must let me help you." The door came open, and he plunged out into the corridor and up the stairs immediately ahead. It was only when he reached the top that he realized the heavy steel door in front of him led to the roof. He jerked up the catch. "Why, Mr. Rand, you mustn't run away. I'm coming after you." Then he was out on the gritty gravel of the roof. The night sky was clouded and murky with a faint pinkish glow from the neon signs. From the distant mills rose a ghostly spurt of flame. He ran to the edge. The street lights glared dizzily upward. Two men walking were round blobs of hat and shoulders. He swung around. The thing was in the doorway. The door was no longer solicitous, but moronically playful, each sentence ending in a titter. "Why, Mr. Rand, why have you come up here? You're all alone. Just think, I might push you off." The thing came slowly toward him. He moved backward until his heels touched the low parapet. Without knowing why or what he was going to do, he dropped to his knees. The face he dared not look at came nearer, a focus for the worst in the world, a gathering point for poisons from everywhere. Then the lucidity of terror took possession of his mind, and words formed on his lips. "I will obey you. You are my God," he said. "You have supreme power over man and his animals and his machines. You rule this city and all others. I recognize that." Again the titter, closer. "Why, Mr. Rand, you never talked like this before. Do you mean it? The world is yours to do with as you will, save or tear to pieces." He answered fawningly as the words automatically fitted themselves together into vaguely liturgical patterns. "I recognize that. I will praise. I will sacrifice. In smoke and soot and flame, I will worship you forever. The voice did not answer. He looked up. There was only Miss Millick, deathly pale and swaying drunkenly. Her eyes were closed. He caught her as she wobbled toward him. His knees gave way under the added weight, and they sank down together on the edge of the roof. After a while, she began to twitch. Small noises came from her throat, and her eyelids edged open. Come on, we'll go downstairs, he murmured, trying to draw her up. You're feeling bad. I'm terribly dizzy, she whispered. I must have fainted. I didn't eat enough, and then I'm so nervous lately about the war and everything, I guess. Why, we're on the roof. Did you bring me up here to get some air, or did I come up without knowing it? I'm awfully foolish. I used to walk in my sleep, my mother said. As he helped her down the stairs, she turned and looked at him. Why, Mr. Rand, she said faintly, you've got a big black smudge on your forehead. Here, let me get it off for you. Weakly, she rubbed at it with her handkerchief. She started to sway again, and he steadied her. No, I'll be all right, she said. Only I feel cold. What happened, Mr. Rand? Did I have some sort of fainting spell? He told her it was something like that. Later, riding home in an empty elevated car, he wondered how long he would be safe from the thing. It was a purely practical problem. He had no way of knowing, but instinct told him he had satisfied the brute for some time. Would it want more when it came again? Time enough to answer that question when it arose. It might be hard, he realized, to keep out of an insane asylum. With Helen and Ronnie to protect as well as himself, he would have to be careful and tight-lipped. He began to speculate as to how many other men and women had seen this thing, or things like it. The elevated train slowed and lurched in a familiar fashion. He looked at the roofs again near the curve. They seemed very ordinary, as if what made them impressive had gone away for a while. And that's the end of that story. Now, let's see. I can run past the hour, so let's do something here. What would be... How about a nasty little Brothers Grimm story? I always liked the Brothers Grimm. And this one has this is one of my very favorite Brothers Grimm stories. No, not that one. That's not it. Okay, there we go. So I hope you're all still there. And let me find it. There's like 912 stories in this one. Okay, as I said, this is one of my old favorites. It's called The Juniper Tree. And by the way, this is from Original Folk and Fairy Tales of the Brothers Grimm, the complete first edition. I believe many of these are translated by Jack Zipes, but not necessarily all of them. So I'll try to check on that later if anybody wants to know. The Juniper Tree. All this took place a long time ago, most likely some 2,000 years ago. There was a rich man who had a beautiful and pious wife, and they loved each other very much. Though they didn't have any children, they longed to have some. Day and night the wife prayed for a child, but still none came, and everything remained the same. Now, in the front of the house there was a yard, and in the yard stood a juniper tree. One day, during winter, the wife was under the tree peeling an apple, and as she was peeling it, she cut her finger, and her blood dripped into the snow. "Oh," said the wife, and she heaved a great sigh. While she looked at the blood before her, she became quite sad. If only I had a child as red as blood and as white as snow." Upon saying that, her mood changed, and she became very cheerful, for she felt something might come of it. Then she went home. After a month, the snow vanished. After 2 months, everything turned green. After 3 months, the flowers sprouted from the ground. After 4 months, all the trees in the woods grew more solid, and the green branches became intertwined. The birds began to sing, and their songs resounded throughout the forest as the blossoms fell from the trees. Soon the 5th month passed, and when the wife stood under the juniper tree, it smelled so sweetly that her heart leapt for joy. Indeed, she was so overcome by joy that she fell down on her knees. When the 6th month had passed, the fruit was large and firm, and she was quite still. In the 7th month, she picked the juniper berries and ate them so avidly that she became sad and sick. After the 8th month passed, she called to her husband and wept. "If I die," she said, "bury me under the juniper tree." After that, she was quite content and relieved until the 9th month had passed. Then she had a child, as white as snow and as red as blood. When she saw the baby, she was so delighted that she died. Her husband buried her under the juniper tree, and he began weeping a great deal. After some time, he felt much better, but he still wept every now and then. Eventually, he stopped, and after more time passed, he took another wife. With his second wife, he had a daughter, while the child from the first wife was a little boy who was red as blood and as white as snow. Whenever the woman looked at her daughter, she felt great love for her, but whenever she looked at the little boy, her heart was cut to the quick. She couldn't forget that he would always stand in her way and prevent her daughter from inheriting everything, which was what the woman had in mind. Gradually, the devil took hold of her and influenced her feelings toward the boy until she became quite cruel toward him. She pushed him from one place to the next, slapped him here and cuffed him there, so that the poor child lived in constant fear. When he came home from school, he found no peace at all. One day the woman went up to her room, and her little daughter followed her and said, "Mother, give me an apple." "Yes, my child," said the woman, and she gave her a beautiful apple from the chest that had a large, heavy lid with a big, sharp iron lock. "Mother," said the little daughter, "shouldn't brother get one too?" The woman was irritated by that remark, but she said, "Yes, as soon as he comes home from school." And when she looked out the window and saw him coming, the devil took possession of her, and she snatched the apple away from her daughter. "You shan't have one before your brother," she said, and threw the apple into the chest and shut it. Meanwhile, the little boy came through the door, and the devil compelled her to be friendly to him and say, "Would you like to have an apple, my son?" Yet she gave him a fierce look. "Mother," said the little boy, "how ferocious you look. Yes, give me an apple." Then she felt compelled to coax him. "Come over here," she said as she lifted the lid. "Take out an apple for yourself." And as the little boy leaned over the chest, the devil prompted her, and crash! She slammed the lid so hard that his head flew off and fell among the apples. Then she was struck by fear and thought, "How am I going to get out of this?" She went up to her room and straight to her dresser, where she took out a white kerchief from a drawer. She put the boy's head back on his neck and tied the neckerchief around it so nothing could be seen. Then she set him on a chair in front of the door and put the apple in his hand. Some time later, little Marlena came into the kitchen and went up to her mother, who was standing by the fire in front of a pot of hot water, which she was constantly stirring. "Mother," said Marlena, "brother's sitting by the door and looks very pale. He's got an apple in his hand, and I asked him to give me the apple, but he didn't answer, and I became very scared." "Go back to him," said the mother, "and if he doesn't answer you, give him a box on the ear." Little Marlena returned to him and said, "Brother, give me the apple." But he wouldn't respond. So she gave him a box on the ear, and his head fell off. The little girl was so frightened that she began to cry and howl. Then she ran to her mother and said, "Oh, mother, I've knocked my brother's head off." And she wept and couldn't be comforted. "Marlena," said the mother, "what have you done? You're not to open your mouth about this. We don't want anyone to know. And besides, there's nothing we can do about it now. So we'll make a stew out of him." The mother took the little boy and chopped him into pieces. Next, she put them into a pot and let them stew. But Marlena stood nearby and wept until all her tears fell into the pot, so it didn't need any salt. When the father came home, he sat down at the table and asked, "Where's my son?" The mother served a huge portion of the stewed meat, and Marlena wept and couldn't stop. "Where's my son?" the father asked again. "Oh," said the mother, "he's gone off into the country to visit his mother's great-uncle. He intends to stay there a while." "What's he going to do there? He didn't even say goodbye to me." "Well, he wanted to go very badly and asked me if he could stay there 6 weeks. They'll take good care of him." "Oh, that makes me sad," said the man. "It's not right. He should have said goodbye to me." Then he began to eat and said, "Marlena, what are you crying for? Your brother will come back soon." Without pausing, he said, "Oh, wife, the food tastes wonderful. Give me some more." The more he ate, the more he wanted. "Give me some more," he said. "I'm not going to share this with you. Somehow I feel as if it were all mine." As he ate and ate, he threw the bones under the table until he was all done. Meanwhile, Marlena went to her dresser and took out her best silk neckerchief from the bottom drawer, gathered all the bones from beneath the table, tied them up in her silk kerchief, and carried them outside the door. There she wept bitter tears and laid the bones beneath the juniper tree. As she put them there, she suddenly felt relieved and stopped crying. Now the juniper tree began to move. The branches separated and came together again as though they were clapping their hands in joy. At the same time, smoke came out of the tree, and in the middle of the smoke there was a flame that seemed to be humming. Then a beautiful bird flew out of the fire and began singing magnificently. He soared high in the air, and after he vanished, the juniper tree was as it was before. Yet the silk kerchief was gone. Marlena was very happy and gay. It was as if her brother was still alive, and she went merrily back into the house, sat down at the table, and ate. Meanwhile, the bird flew away, landed on the roof of a goldsmith's house, and began to sing. "My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister, Marlena, she made sure to see. My bones were gathered secretly, bound nicely in silk, as neat as can be, and laid beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a lovely bird I am." The goldsmith was sitting in his workshop making a golden chain. When he heard the bird singing on his roof, he thought the song was very beautiful. Then he stood up, and as he walked across the threshold, he lost a slipper. Still, he kept on going right into the middle of the street with only one sock and a slipper on. He was also wearing his apron, and in one of his hands he held the golden chain, in the other his tongs. The sun was shining brightly on the street as he walked, and then he stopped to get a look at the bird. "Bird," he said, "how beautifully you sing. Sing me that song again." "No," said the bird, "I never sing twice for nothing. Give me the golden chain, and I'll sing it for you again." "All right," said the goldsmith. "Here's the golden chain. Now sing the song again." The bird swooped down, grasped the golden chain in his right claw, went up to the goldsmith, and began singing. "My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister, Marlena, she made sure to see. My bones were gathered secretly, bound nicely in silk, as neat as can be, and laid beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a lovely bird I am." Then the bird flew off to a shoemaker, landed on his roof, and sang. My mother, she killed me. My father, he ate me. My sister Marlena, she made sure to see. My bones were gathered secretly, bound nicely in silk as neat as can be, and laid beneath the juniper tree. When the shoemaker heard the song, he ran to the door in his shirt sleeves and looked up at the roof, keeping his hand over his eyes to protect them from the bright sun. "Bird," he said, "how beautifully you sing." Then he called into the house, "Wife, come out here for a second. There's a bird up there. Just look. How beautifully he sings." Then he called his daughter and her children, and the journeymen, apprentices, and maid. They all came running out into the street and looked at the bird and saw how beautiful he was. He had bright red and green feathers, and his neck appeared to glisten like pure gold, while his eyes sparkled in his head like stars. "Bird," said the shoemaker, "now sing me that song again." "No," said the bird, "I never sing twice for nothing. You'll have to give me a present." "Wife," said the man, "go into the shop. There's a pair of red shoes on the top shelf. Get them for me." His wife went and fetched the shoes. "There," said the man, "now sing the song again." The bird swooped down, grasped the shoes in his left claw, flew back up on the roof, and sang. When the bird finished the song, he flew away. He had the chain in his right claw and the shoes in his left, and he flew far away to a mill. The mill went clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. The miller had 20 men sitting in the mill, and they were hewing a stone. Their chisels went click-clack, 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 and the mill kept going clickety-clack, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. The bird swooped down and landed on a linden tree outside the mill and sang, "My mother, she killed me." Then one of the men stopped working. "My father, he ate me." Then 2 more stopped and listened. "My sister Marlena, she made sure to see." Then 4 more stopped. "My bones were gathered secretly, bound nicely in silk as neat as can be." Now only 8 kept chiseling. "And laid beneath the juniper tree." Now only 5, now only 1. "Tweet, tweet, what a lovely bird I am." Then the last one also stopped and listened to the final words. "Bird, how beautifully you sing. Let me hear that too. Sing your song again for me." "No," said the bird, "I never sing twice for nothing. Give me the millstone and I'll sing the song again." "I would if I could," he said, "but the millstone doesn't belong to me alone." "If he sings again," said the others, "he can have it." Then the bird swooped down, and all 20 of the miller's men took some wooden beams to lift the stone. "Heave, ho! Heave, ho! Heave, ho!" Then the bird stuck his neck through the hole, put the stone on like a collar, flew back to the tree, and sang his song. After the bird had finished, he spread his wings, and in his right claw he had the chain, in his left the shoes, and around his neck the millstone. Then he flew away to his father's house. The father, mother, and Marlena were sitting at the table in the parlor, and the father said, "Oh, how happy I am! I feel so wonderful." "Not me," said the mother. I feel scared, as if a storm were about to erupt." Meanwhile, Marlena just sat there and kept weeping. Then the bird flew up, and when he landed on the roof, the father said, "Oh, I am in such good spirits. The sun's shining so brightly outside, and I feel as though I were going to see an old friend again." "Not me," said his wife. "I'm so frightened that my teeth are chattering. I feel as if fire were running through my veins." She tore open her bodice, while Marlena sat in a corner and kept weeping. She had her handkerchief in front of her eyes and wept until it was completely soaked with her tears. The bird swooped down on the juniper tree, where he perched on the branch and began singing. "My mother, she killed me." The mother stopped her ears, shut her eyes, and tried not to see or hear anything. But there was a roaring in her ears like a turbulent storm, and her eyes burned and flashed like lightning. My father, he ate me. Oh, mother, said the man, listen to that beautiful bird singing so gloriously. The sun's so warm, and it smells like cinnamon. My sister Marlena made sure to see. Then Marlena laid her head on her knees and wept and wept. But the man said, I'm going outside. I must see this bird close up. Oh, don't go, cried the wife. I feel as if the whole house were shaking and about to go up in flames. Nevertheless, the man went out and looked at the bird. My bones were gathered secretly, bound nicely in silk, as neat as can be, and laid beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a lovely bird I am. After ending his song, the bird dropped the golden chain, and it fell around the man's neck just right, so that it fit him perfectly. Then he went inside and said, Look how lovely that bird is. He gave me this beautiful golden chain, and he's just beautiful as well. But the woman was petrified and fell to the floor. Her cap slipped off her head, and the bird sang again, My mother, she killed me. Oh, I wish I were 1,000 feet beneath the earth so I wouldn't have to hear this. My father, he ate me. Then the woman fell down again as if she were dead. My sister Marlena, she made sure to see. Oh, said Marlena, I want to go outside too and see if the bird will give me something. Then she went out. My bones were gathered secretly, bound nicely in silk, as neat as can be. All at once the bird threw down the shoes and laid them beneath the juniper tree. Marlena felt cheerful and happy. She put on the new red shoes and danced and skipped back into the house. Oh, she said, I was so sad when I went out, and now I feel so cheerful. That certainly is a splendid bird. He gave me a pair of red shoes as a gift. Not me, said the wife, who jumped, and her hair flared up like red-hot flames. I feel as if the world was coming to an end. Maybe I'd feel better if I went outside. As she went out the door, crash! The bird threw the millstone down on her head, and she was crushed to death. The father and Marlena heard the crash and went outside. Smoke, flames, and fire were rising from the spot, and when it was over, the little brother was standing there. He took his father and Marlena by the hand, and all three were very happy. Then they went into the house, sat down at the table, and ate. One can only hope they weren't still eating what was left over of the kid. Anyway, well, that all took longer than I thought, so we'll have to read the other things I was planning to read. Oops, didn't mean to do that. I'll have to read the other things I was planning to read at 7 p.m. Tonight. And I think I'll run a little late for tonight, so not suggesting that those of you on European time stay up for it or anything like that, more suggesting that you might want to check it out because it'll probably be a longer than usual version. And so you can go and hear one of the recorded versions on tadwilliams.com or on YouTube or here, and where you're viewing it now. It will remain as a recorded thing, for lack of a better word. Anyway, so with that, I am going to say thank you for joining me for early Halloween morning, for most people, very early Halloween morning. In fact, Halloween morning is always early because Halloween's not really a morning kind of thing now, is it? The day after Halloween, that's another thing because everybody's eating leftover candy and you start in the morning. Anyway, so, but whatever you celebrate this time of the year, and we all know these holidays far, far predate Saint Walpurga or All Saints Day or Christmas or anything else like that. These are old, old holidays from probably before human beings could even talk. So enjoy your holiday wherever you are and however you celebrate it. If you do it all, I realize not everybody is as Halloweeny as Americans are, but we're pretty Halloweeny here. So I want to thank you once again for joining me. And I had a good time. I hope you did too. And I will see you next at 7 p.m. my time. And after that, we will begin something new, I think, in the way of reading. Maybe I'll read from a novel of mine or something. We'll see. But not the next one. The next one at 7 o'clock is my Halloween one. And I'll be reading more scary stories, kids. So just remember, I don't remember what I was going to tell you to just remember. I think it had something to do with the children of the night, what beautiful music they make. But anyway, thank you for joining me. It's a great pleasure as always to have you. Be good to each other. Don't scare each other too badly. Share your candy. Very important. You don't have to share all of it. And in fact, if you want to, you can give people the Good and Plenties and the Mike and Ikes and that other stuff and save the chocolate bars for yourself. That's perfectly legitimate. But be good to each other. It's important. So with that, I say thank you very much, and I will see you again very soon. Happy Halloween.